Yeah, you're right. Every kind of music, every artistic activity has its unique potential for failure. And then there's also a
Yeah.
thing. This term I used. I this term I used. I came up with on my blog, and I was very pleased with it. And then I realized it's actually just a version. It's my Ponzi version of there's too much of there's too you can have too much of a good thing. But I call it the zone of fruitless intensification. Like there's almost an
Right.
axis. Any kind of music has an axis that works really well up to a certain point, but then you just try to go further on that axis, and it just becomes unenjoyable.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello there, welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hochuli in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and today we're talking about future music. You're gonna hear George and myself interviewing the music critic Simon Reynolds in just a second. This is part of our ongoing attempt to explore the contours of the politics of the 21st century, but also look at its social and cultural aspects. And this is part of our attempt to do that. So very excited to be talking to Simon Reynolds in just a second. So this podcast has been away for a week. Normally we have an episode every Tuesday and additional episodes on Thursday or Friday most weeks. But this past week we haven't done. I've been ill with dengue fever. So, but on the mend, and we're back. So for those who don't know, we put out 2 episodes a month for free. The rest of our episodes in full are only at patreon.com/bungacast. There you'll find shows that are regular contributors: Alex Gurovich, Catherine Liu, Amber Lee Frost, and Lee Phillips. And we also have episodes with writers and editors from Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered. Subscribers also get a free subscription to Damage Magazine. So if you haven't signed up to our Patreon, here's a couple of things you may have missed over the past month or so. We had Dustin Guastella on talking about antisocial socialism and social breakdown. There's also the full episode of Alex Gurovich talking to his father, Peter Gurovich, about their fascinating family history, about Mensheviks, the USSR, the Nazis, escape from Moscow, escape from Paris, escape from Berlin, and much else besides. I have our discussion of Alex Garland's Civil War, and we explored the politics or the lack of politics that are portrayed therein. And in the Reading Club, we discussed Isaac Deutscher's monumental biography of Stalin. Coming up very soon, we have 2 episodes on Mexico, its elections, what AMLO represents, and how he's become one of the few left-wing successes in the region, and indeed the world. We're going to have Achin Van Eyck back on the podcast to talk about India and Hindu nationalism, as we ask whether the sheen is coming off Modi finally. We will be talking about zone of interest, Holocaust films, and what should be done about Auschwitz. And we'll be very soon responding to your questions, comments, and criticisms on the range of episodes that we've put out and all the discussion that is ongoing at patreon.com/bungacast. It's always a lively discussion there. So if you're a member, or if you'd like to be, do check it out. And finally, one last announcement before we start the interview. If you've been a longtime subscriber, thank you. But we should let you know that if you're on one of those old $5 or $10 tiers, those are going to be eclipsed very soon. So if you would like to upgrade, it's only $2 more a month, and you'll get double of what you previously got. We'll have 4 original episodes a month, and the Reading Club if you subscribe to that as well. We hope you will join us.
Yeah, so delighted to be joined this afternoon by Simon Reynolds, who's the author of Rip It Up and Start, well, a number of books. I'm going to go through them all on music history, I guess. Rip It Up and Start Again, Post-Punk 1978 to 84, Retromania, pop culture's addiction to its own past, Energy Flash, a journey through rave music and dance culture, and Shock and Awe, glam rock and its legacy. He's also a freelance contributor to The Guardian, Pitchfork, and The New York Times, and blogs at Blissblog, and teaches in the experimental pop program at the California Institute of Arts. Thanks very much for joining us, Simon.
Oh, my pleasure.
And listeners may or may not be able to hear a wood chipper in the background. There's some neighbours of Simon's just destroying some trees.
It's the sound of the future, I hear.
Yeah, it's very it's very much like the one of the Interna Mori made by Russolo, of the Italian futurists. It's like grinding, unpleasant sound, but they're making swift work of these trees, so we could have peace soon. The tranquility of suburbia.
Nice. Well, it's definitely the sound of the destruction of the past. Whether that's the sound of the future or not is one of the things we might well get into discussing Futuromania, your new book. But before we go onto that, just wanted to touch on Retromania. I think this is a book that many of our listeners might well have heard of. Well, particularly if they're attentive readers of our book, it does get a citation in there. And I remember reading this when it came out in the late noughties, early 2010s, and really enjoying it. So this was, to transport you back to this age, listeners. The abundance of the MP3 seemed to, coincide with the inability of pop music narrowly, and maybe popular culture more widely, to reach beyond its most recent past. So the past of kind of living memory. It wasn't a renaissance because it didn't look back that far. It was 80s nights or 60s nights in the 90s, that kind of thing, but on steroids almost. So yeah, I mean, so for listeners who haven't read the book, have I vaguely got this right? Was this the kind of the phenomenon that you were wanting to write about in Retromania?
Yeah, Retromania really came out of kind of the discussions and on the blog scene through much of the 2000s, sort of really taking off around the middle of 2000, late 2000s, where it just felt like, myself, Mark Fisher on his K-Punk blog, a lot of other people on the scene, this thing of retro culture and a feeling of paralysis and inundation of the past, this sort of explosion of an archival online culture. YouTube, there were these blogs that were, there was the file sharing thing, but there's also like blogs that were putting up whole albums, curating the past. And if you looked at the music scene, it just seemed to be simultaneous revivals. Like, there was an 80s revival that went on, as a friend of mine quipped, went on longer than the actual 80s did. There was, there'd been a sort of garage revival in the early 2000s. There was a sort of retro soul thing with Amy Winehouse and Duffy and Adele. There was, you name it, everything was being revived. There was like free folk revival. So for sort of, I guess, what you could just accurately, not even unfairly, but accurately describe as the aging modernists on this blog scene, i.e. myself, Mark Fisher, who was, a bit younger than me, but like very much shaped by post-punk and then by the rave jungle thing. There was this sort of feeling of like, where is the spirit of musical modernism gone? And you could see it wasn't just music. There was fashion seemed to be just locked in an endless cycle of regurgitating the often quite recent past. There was film remakes. There was, I don't know, it didn't seem to be, the art, even the art world had like a craze for reenactments or restagings of exhibitions, like legendary exhibitions of modernism were restaged. Then this sort of retro modernism thing. I don't know, there doesn't seem to be an area of culture that wasn't touched by this, wasn't infected by this sort of retro virus. So yeah, I just thought, there's a book here, and although much of it has a sort of tone of indictment, there's also a sort of sense of complicity, because some retro culture I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed like sort of an artist like Ariel Pink. There was this sort of hauntology scene that me and K-Punk and others really liked, which I sort of rationalized it as like kind of good retro, like there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. This is the good retro, like was setting the ghosts of the past in interesting motion, So it gets into this thing of how do you define an interesting use of the past with stuff that's just a sort of very blank pastiche, like a completely empty reenactment of it. So yeah, I just had a lot of fun. I was always quite gloomy book. I had a lot of fun doing it because I was able to research all the history of revivalism. I had a whole chapter on fashion, which was not a thing I'd ever really thought about much. And I'd say he wasn't a very stylish dresser. And I just found, getting into the history of fashion and the way that fashion has had this economy of reviving things. I just found that really fascinating. So it was a sort of fun project, but also the ultimate tenor of it was somewhat gloomy, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that was probably the cultural moment of the noughties, early 2010s. There was that kind of gloominess. Where is the? I think you put it really well. Where is the spirit of musical modernism? We could maybe ask that question today, but we do want to talk about your new book. And before getting on to that, just I guess as a bit of context in terms of how people, or like what are in terms of the dominant attitudes towards popular music, or these kind of, maybe they're like critical positions or like music critical traditions. I think that's probably putting it a bit strongly perhaps, but yeah, two terms, rockism and poptimism. I mean, are these basically like proponents of rock, proponents of pop, and we're going to be talking about electro? Is that too simple way to put it?
Well, rockism and popism had this sort of long history. It's funny how it did blow up as a big discussion in the 2000s. There was a much quoted and cited piece by Khalifa Sana in the New York Times, which is now, considered to be the inventing of these terms, which is not the case. I don't think the piece actually says that, but these are things that were discussed in blogs and online forums for years before that, but they actually go back right to I think 1980 is when Pete Wiley from Wah in The Enemy coined this term rockism. And, so for me, these terms have been terms that have been part of my critical vocabulary before I was a writer. Like just, something you would bandy around. Basically, I think initially the idea of rockism as a negative concept was to sort of say, well, there's this fixation on the, like say the model of the band that, say, a band like the Clash represented, which was in a sense only a remodeling of the Who or the Stones, like four-man rock band setting the world to rights, guitar heroes, this guitar kills fascism, that sort of whole idea of and pop. The people didn't use the word poptimism at that time. Writers like Paul Morley would be talking about new pop. This was a sort of, you wanted to get rid of all these sort of decaying myths of rock and the fixation on the sort of rock singer as hero setting the world to rights, and you wanted to talk about pleasure and the joys of music that was not necessarily carrying deep meanings or deep sort of substance, but might be just pure fun. It was at the time there were groups like Altered Images. There was the early Depeche Mode. Early Depeche Mode seemed like a sort of pure teeny pop group. Ironically, later they became extremely serious and political and actually rather rockist. Even though they didn't have any guitars in their sound, they became completely rockist. And then Dave Gahan were even more rockist and became like a sort of drug-taking grunge figure in LA. But that's another story. The idea was sort of like a kind of, I think of it actually, sort of early pro-pop arguments, the decrying rockism. I think of it as sort of, in some ways, a bit like Oscar Wilde. It's like sort of surfaces everything. There's nothing. Music doesn't have to be deep and meaningful. It doesn't have to have a lot of content. It doesn't need to be trying to change the world. It's just to brighten up your life. And it was an appreciation of. It's very like Warholism as well. Like the enjoyment of the commercial product nature of the modern world. Of modern pop music.
Yeah.
And at that particular time, in the early 80s, it was, a bunch of groups embracing pop video, embracing danceability, style, So these arguments went back and forth, and then you got by the 2000s, people were talking about it's more. I took on a historical thing of like, well, there are these parts of music history that have been neglected and demeaned because they don't supposedly aren't serious, like disco or whatever. But funny thing is, if you go back to the 70s, you read people making pro-disco arguments that are very much like these arguments. They're like, well, no, it's not. It is escapist. It is glitzy. It is, doesn't have that sort of Bob Dylan-like lyrical content, but it works in a different way. It's sensual. It speaks to gay eroticism. It speaks. Girls love it. It's this sort of. Let's get away from the celebrating disco in terms of they were unrock, and you can find people doing that from the very beginnings of disco, like making these sort of arguments. And you even have people in the early 70s defending glam rock in these sort of same terms, saying it's just great. It's great fun music. It doesn't have any serious intent. Some of the arguments made in favor of the New York Dolls were like, they have no redeeming social value, and that's what's good about them.
Yeah,
so
I think
it's like a discursive poptimism is a discursive position within criticism and fan culture. That as soon as you get people celebrating, Dylan or Beatles as these sort of artists and trying to change the world, you have other people like actually that you're missing the point, and that the point of pop music is not to be this heavy, substance thing.
I got a great example this morning in looking at the Financial Times. This is from the Financial Times podcast, which, presumably a serious paper, but which it's Life and Art from the FT Weekend podcast is about Billie Eilish. Billie Eilish still doesn't care, and it's still working. Billie Eilish's new album, which addresses body shaming, queerness, and fame, is beloved by critics and fans. The hosts discuss her legacy, and I thought, well, I mean, there's so much actually, which I think one can kind of pick out and kind of laugh at. But I thought her legacy particularly stood out to me because how long has she been around? Like 6 years or something.
Well, this brings up the point, which is that a lot of the arguments that people make in favor of Beyonce and Taylor Swift are, to me, rockist arguments, because they're arguing like she's meaningful, she's addressing these issues. It's actually the ponderous discourse that would once surrounded post-punk groups like the Au Pairs and henceforth the Clash way back to the 60s. So that's one of the ironies of this thing, is that you, to me, I think it's an interesting argument, and I can see the appeal of it in different contexts. Like sometimes I'll want to use a rockist type argument and talk about Burial, about how Burial's music, the social fabric is dealt with in the decay of urban life. Other times I want to celebrate music for being just purely about the transient thrill, and so I don't have any real hard and fast commitment to either side of this argument. I just enjoy it as a sort of strange discursive game, really.
No, I think that the way you kind of summarized it there, or put it, on the one hand, the rockist sort of argument would be to do with artists changing the world, maybe bringing in authenticity, possibly, but not necessarily. That older model of, four guys with guitars, drum and bass, and that poptimism arguments are more about surface glamour, escapism. But that interesting point you made at the end, that in fact you can have rockist arguments about Beyonce and Taylor Swift, particularly. I guess and
you can have popist arguments about groups that have the guitar, bass, drums, lineup. Like say a group like Jet. I don't know if you remember Jet. They were like Australian. Garage music. It's absolutely vapid music. But that tune, Are You Going to Go? Well, what's it called? Are You Going to Go With Me?
Are You Going to Go My Way?
Be my girl, isn't it?
Are You Going to Be My Girl? Yeah. It's just pure vacant fun, and so you can endlessly flip around these arguments, and you can the Sweet, actually, were a 70s glam band, were quite a hard rocking group. They secretly wished to be Deep Purple, great riffs and stuff. It's the format is rock, but the whole context of them is the format of the Sweet is rock in the narrow sense of guitars, bass, and drums, and a guy shouting. but the actual whole thing of it is completely frivolous and vapid.
No, I think these are two. These are it's
enjoyable.
yeah. No, I mean two ways to kind of justify, defend music, or two kind of, I guess, discursive positions which can be applied to any sort of styles of music. Because I did want to move us onto the new book. So this is Futuromania: Electronic Dreams, Desiring Machines, and Tomorrow's Music Today. So
Quite a
yeah,
mouthful, isn't it?
yeah. But it's, I guess, it's maybe a more heterogeneous sort of set of um, musicians and artists of various different sorts than a book about post punk. You might have quite a clear list of who would be in the latter sort of book. So I guess just for listeners who haven't read the whole thing, just to kind of, I guess, yeah. What sort of music are we talking about here? So
I think the
I
way
mean,
it
maybe just an open
coheres,
question like that. How would you describe this sort of music?
like most of it is electronic music, and some of it is dance music, but some of it's sort of, there's I talk about ambient music, I talk about synth pop, which I suppose is danceable, but it's not primarily designed for clubs. It's not in the way that, say, jungle that I also write about is. There's some stuff on rap music where electronic music is, I have a whole thing on grime because it's got a very interesting electronic sound. The autotune rap stuff because of the processing of the voice. But I suppose, more than even the electronicness, what makes it cohere thematically is sort of, I think nearly every thing that I write about has this sort of idea of the future or futurism. So like either, the futurism in the sense of the music being like innovative and conjuring ideas of the future, but also the thematics. Sometimes it's just the sound, but usually both are going on in place. Kraftwerk is an obvious example because they're doing pioneering stuff with technology, and in the 70s they're making the music that will become much more widespread in the 80s with synth pop, and then the 90s with techno and trance. But also the thematics are not always, but largely somehow bound up with the future. They're talking about robots, or they're talking about computers, computer dating. Sometimes they have this interesting thing where they go back to the early 20th century sort of futurism, when you get into this kind of retro modernism thing with the influence from Fritz Lang. They did a track called Metropolis. There's Autobahn. They're not talking really about Autobahn now. They're trying to conjure the excitement of the Autobahn in the between the wars era of Germany. Trans-Europe Express again. It's sort of like almost nostalgia for the modernism. And then there's the artwork of the album Man Machine. They're using is it El Lissitzky or Malevich is one of those Soviet modernist designers. They're ripping off the design.
So I guess this idea of future, I think future music is, because I had a few other, so machine music, tomorrow's music today, electronic music, I think is too narrow. I think it is, that's what really sticks with you in the book. It is future music, both in sound and often in content as well. And just, I guess, to kind of bring the listeners on something, I don't think we need to do a full history, but I think it is worth just quickly probably talking about the starting point of this that you give in the book. So you start with an essay on Donna Summer's I Feel Love, and then you follow up with one on Kraftwerk, which is how they created pop's future. And this Donna Summer record is, actually listening to it again after reading the chapter, I was like, whoa, that is, I didn't kind of realize how
still futuristic, isn't it?
How good it sounds.
Yeah.
So this kind of incredible record produced by Giorgio Moroder and Pete Bellotte, released in July 1977. So kind of, a date which some people might say is the start of punk, with the Sex Pistols perhaps, but this is the starting point of this kind of music. So is it too simple to say that you have this? It's Donna Summer plus Kraftwerk, and that's the birth of future music.
It is. It is a little. There's always things you can point to, and in an early, this book's come out in other countries. In an earlier incarnation of the book, I had a whole thing on this funny thing. I call them the friendly futurists, which is like how a lot of the very first things done with synths were done by these easy listening guys like Jean-Jacques Perry and Gershon Kingsley. Did these kind of very frivolous, middle of the road things using Moogs. Often, because these were the only people who could afford to access these expensive synths. So there are various things. Tangerine Dream did sort of hypnotic, pulse-based stuff, but this is the first time where you had a record. I think this is pretty much the first time you had a pop record. Certainly one that was a huge global hit, where every element except the voice is made using a machine, and the whole feel of it is this sort of mechanistic. It has this sort of untouched by human hands feeling about it, And even Donna Summer's vocal has a kind of etherealized. No, it's not exactly that she's like an android, but there's some, she's kind of beyond the human. She sort of, it's got a very floaty, transcendent thing that she must have come up with in response to the track, I think. It was unusual for them because usually they start with all their previous songs. They started with like a vocal melody and a piano, a keyboard sort of thing, and then they built it up. They built this track from the bottom up, from the rhythm track, and then they added layers of this flickering bass, sort of strobing bass line they created, where actually there's a minuscule flicker between the two speakers, so left and right. So I describe it as something like. I don't know, I can't remember what I say, something like an epilepsy turned into a beat or something like that. It's like a sort of convulsive pulsing of it's a strobing effect really with sound, and it just seemed, although the whole thing obviously only exists because of these unusual humans who made it, it had a feeling like it wasn't made by humans. Like this was some, people described as hearing it as if it was like something that landed on the radio like a UFO, like it sort of came out of nowhere. And then the vocal has this sort of ascending and descending thing. So she seems to be floating off into space. It's a song about love and sex, but has this kind of utopian, I use this word pornotopian actually to describe some of this electronic disco. And there is a link between porn and erotica and the singles bar culture of disco, and then gay bathhouses as well. This guy Patrick Cowley made these amazing Moog soundtracks that were inspired by his bathhouse experiences in San Francisco. And he was someone who's, he was a pioneer of high energy music, gay club music of the 80s, and his whole world was changed when he heard I Feel Love. He was like, this is what I want to do.
Yeah, I mean, just as I said, listening to it again, also you make the point in the book that it's not I'm in love, it's I feel love. So it's even the kind of distancing from the feeling. The whole thing is very transcendental and not quite post-human yet, but maybe kind of coming onto that. I mean,
when she danced, she would do kind of when she did it on stage, she would do like these sort of robotic movements to it. So it's sort of, I always think of it in the context of, I don't know, films like Barbarella. There's a machine, I can't remember what it's called, but it's kind of like sort of orgasmatron machine. And then there's, in the film Logan's Run, there's a kind of a place called the Love Shop, which is kind of like a sort of high-tech erotic parlor, It's sort of a vision, I think a lot of the disco and then later house music has this sort of idea of future sex, utopian erotica kind of vibe.
So, I mean, it seems like the starting point is then a combination of all these things. So obviously the synthesizer, the Moog is, which I think just a couple of days ago, Moog had a birthday, or I heard this on the radio, and it was an excuse for some pretty good songs to be played. But so you have this iconic synthesizer produced, which can produce all these sounds which never previously heard. You have this kind of technology giving a precision of rhythm, which sounds kind of not human, and then you have kind of all the I guess the social context as well, and maybe an aesthetic either with Kraftwerk, kind of retro futurism, or Donna Summer maybe kind of porno futurism, or some that's not a good coinage, but you know what I'm
Oh, it's not
trying to
bad.
say here, maybe. So this is the kind of the first period, or the start.
Yeah,
What
I think
how
so.
does
I
it
think
develop after this? Because obviously, like, this is the blueprint for pop, and I think you say in the chapter on Kraftwerk, like, maybe they're more influential than the Beatles, and maybe that's you know, might be something which is almost sounds contrarian when you say it, but actually, like, this is the model of pop music which became universal through the 80s and then onto the 90s. Yeah, so how does this kind of future music develop from this starting point in the late 70s? I mean, basically from July 77 onwards. Yeah, maybe give listeners a bit of a potted history, because
yeah.
there is a lot here, but yeah, what are the main
I mean,
outlines?
there are these stories. I mean, like, you know, and sometimes you think maybe they're legends embellished, but you know, the story of Brian Eno hearing "I Feel Love" and rushing around to David. I think they were in Berlin working on those records, Low or whatever, and he said, uh, this is
Yeah.
the future of club music for the next 15 years, David."
Mm.
And then supposedly the Human League, Martin Ware from the Human League, before they were even called the Human League, I think they were actually originally called the Future. In fact, they, you know, they'd been making kind of quite experimental music. Like, they think they made one track that was 97 minutes long, like a Tangerine Dream, endlessly unfolding
Wow.
electronic soundscape. But then they hear, you know, Martin Ware goes round to the other guy's house, clutching Kraftwerk, Man Machine, and Donna Summer, I Feel Love, and says, "We can do this, and we can do pop music." It gives them the idea that they can do synth music that isn't like noodling experimental
Mm.
stuff, but actually pop. And that's what they do, you know, with Love Action and Don't You Want Me Baby and all the other great Human League hits. New Order, I think, another group who are, you know, I think even when they were Joy Division, Ian Curtis was very interested in electronic music and industrial music and people like Throbbing Gristle. And they sort of carried, you know, once he died, they carried on and they became obsessed with this electronic post-disco sound they were hearing, things, electro music coming out of New York. So, you know, it just becomes like a template that all kinds of bands and artists use, and you get house music, you get high energy music, gay club music, you get by the early 90s, you get trance music, you get techno, all these sort of sounds that, you know, it's not the only influence in there, but it's like Kraftwerk and Donna Summer are a huge part of Kraftwerk, and Moroder are kind of the bulk of the DNA, I think, initially of this music.
So it then kind of, I guess you've got kind of electro pop and mainstream pop, and there's so much in the book that we probably won't have a chance to talk about, from Jean-Michel Jarre and Vangelis, and kind of space music, which, you know, does sound very futuristic, and then obviously kind of electro dance music, I guess, is,
Yeah,
you know, if
and
I
it
don't
gets into
sound too
soundtracks as well. Like, quite a few people who had a
soundtracks.
Moroder association. I'm blanking on the names, but you know that, like, that they're doing these sort of former Moroder associates, and Moroder himself are doing the themes for films and shows like Miami Vice, and you know, big Hollywood films have this sort of electronic glitter, puttering little theme tunes and background music. Someone like
It's
John Carpenter, actually, a lot of his
yeah.
films have his own electronic music on them. Becomes sort of synonymous with a certain kind of uh, action movie, but also like sort of science fiction movie has this sort of
Yeah, I
electronic
mean,
pulsing backdrop.
I think it's, you know, some of these great films in the 80s, particularly as you said, sci-fi films and action films, John Carpenter or Blade Runner. It's this kind of whole sound. So it, you know, it I guess develops then, and you talk in the book about Gabba and jungle, industrial dance, rave, minimal techno, grime, dubstep, all these kind of genres, subgenres, all these kind of things which develop in a number of different ways. But one, I guess, because I'm, you know, talking about music, if listeners have heard this the music we're talking about, they'll maybe instantly get it. If they haven't, it's maybe a bit more of a leap. So definitely pause this if you haven't heard I Feel Love somehow, and go and listen to that, and then re-listen to the conversation. I should have said listen to it before we started talking about it. Pause it then, but too late, unless Alex can edit that in earlier. But yeah, anyway, I did want to talk about intelligent dance music, because this almost seems like, or I guess one position.
Back to rockism and popism again, because it's these same arguments about substance and the context of use of music that make it supposedly more intelligent and stuff that's just aimed for the dance floor. But yeah.
No, I guess does intelligent dance music then sort of show the I don't know, the beginning of the end of this sort of music? I don't know if that's too strong a way to put it, where some of the kind of the energy and the kind of propulsion and the kind of, I don't know, the things which you just have to move to in some of the earlier kind of future music isn't there anymore? Or is there something there? Because I think it's a much maligned genre. And you talk about Boards of Canada specifically, and this album, Music Has the Right to Children, which is I think a particularly interesting one. So yeah, why? I guess I should just put it more directly. Intelligent dance music. Why is this a sort of future music? What is it that, is it the rockist? Is it the poptimism argument? What can you make for this sort of music being good?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it just is, sonically adventurous, melodically gorgeous, emotionally powerful or evocative kind of music. I mean, at the time, I was, when people started banding this word intelligent around, they talked about intelligent techno, intelligent dance music, or electronic listening music was a term that Warp Records pushed around artists like Ortekra and Black Dog and Aphex Twin. I was always a little suspicious of it, because I felt there was a kind of snobbery and a kind of I was very much into the rave scene, and very much like what was emerging as jungle music, this sort of very rowdy, breakbeat driven, kind of insane music that was as much hip hop based on samples and breakbeats as it was sort of synths and those sort of techno-y sounds. I was very much like, this is incredible future, and so I associated a lot of this rhetoric about intelligence with this snobbish move and a sort of idea. There was a sort of idea. The very idea electronic listening music sort of suggests that the right way to listen to music is contemplative, sedentary, maybe lying on the floor with headphones on or in the dark. Bodily inert, basically. Whereas to me, the idea that moving your body to music is somehow stupider just seemed like a really naive notion. And in fact, people who are dancing are actually thinking with their bodies, so I didn't like that opposition, but I did like a lot of the music. I loved the Aphex Twin. I loved Boards of Canada a bit later. And I think the strong suite of IDM is that, usually it has sort of rhythms that just, that sort of are related to techno or house. And then a bit later, they all went crazy for jungle and the chopped up breakbeat thing. But somehow it doesn't, it's not like it sort of, it has that rhythmic form, but it's not got that kind of banging oomph, that would have people charging onto the dance floor. And the real center of the music is the melodies and the atmospheres, and often there's humor as well. Like, Aphex Twin did very, very sort of poignant things, but he also did a lot of kind of somewhat silly songs, like madcap, cartoon, crazy sort of things, or with daft sound bites, like samples of a little boy. I don't know. There's one about I can't remember the kind of almost sort of puerile sense of humor.
Yeah, no, definitely. And in the Aphex Twin videos as well, you can see that sense of humor. If listeners
Boards of Canada are interesting because they are of the IDM scene, and they are, I interviewed them for that piece, and they were like, we were never that really interested in making people dance at all. We didn't see it as club music. Okay, we had these they use a lot of breakbeats, kind of quite slow ones, and you could dance to it, but it's not really what the music's for. It's more about these pictures in your mind it creates, and
So
the nostalgic tonalities they used of the old-fashioned synths. For a lot of people, would stir up memories. Yeah.
So I realised that I should have asked you this sooner, and we're only kind of talking about why IDM intelligent dance music is good. It kind of made me think is like why. So if we're talking about future music here, I guess it's kind of implicit almost. Like one of the things that is good about it is this kind of the newness or this vision of the future. Is so we talked about poptimist kind of arguments about surface and escapism, and rockist ones about authenticity. I mean, is what makes future music so good? Why did you feel kind of compelled to write a book about it? What is it that I guess quite a as I said, a heterogeneous set of sorts of music, but what is it that kind of, I don't know, kind of grabbed you about this? The particularly good ones, maybe some of which we've already talked about. Yeah, what makes it so good?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's sort of like the unexamined assumptions that drive you, and sometimes you don't want to examine them because then your whole drive to do something kind of can vaporize.
Yeah, sorry, I should. But you've written the book though, so maybe this is the time.
No, I mean, I think
to ask you.
There's a bunch of things. I mean, obviously, there's an element of a sort of belief that music should keep moving forward, keep innovating. Now, it can be innovative in ways that don't necessarily conjure up, visions of the future or a post-human world. There a lot of post-punk groups were innovative in other ways. Say a group like the Fall. There's nothing in the trappings of the Fall that is futuristic, but it's a sound you never heard before, a way of using the voice, of lyrical content that it's kind of more primal in some ways, but it's also new. But it's new in a way that it's not new in the way that, say, Gary Newman was new, or Human League where there is this sort of feeling of futurism conjured in part or large part just because of the electronic sounds. Gary Newman had actually most of his songs were based around sort of science fiction kind of novel I think he wrote, or kind of certainly a sort of world he created. So on the one level there's this sort of what's music going to be like, where's it going, can we get there faster, it's a sort of idea that there is a vanguard and certain areas of music that are further into the future of music than other ones that are more lagging. So there's that idea, journalistically there's a sort of enjoyment of this sort of messianic mode, this sort of I be the prophet mode, or at least for someone identifying the cutting edge kind of thing. A lot of it for me personally comes from having been a science fiction fan and especially immediately before I got into music, that was my thing. What I actually thought I would be a science fiction writer. So just a lot of interest in what the future will be like. Whether it's dark and post-apocalyptic, post-catastrophe, dark and dystopian, or better, in some way, or just different,
I guess it's a very evocative sort of genre of music in that sense. The newness, the innovation, the vision of the future, combined with the rhythms and the kind of that body music aspect. So just to flip it round, and this might be easier to answer in a way, like what is the kind of, like with this sort of music, what is the risk, or what is the, if it doesn't work, how does it fail? Because I think if you've written on glam rock, and it strikes me that when that fails, it sort of sounds fake and cringe and overdone, and post-punk, when that fails, it sort of sounds, I don't know, just abrasive, but not, it doesn't have any
didactic in a really
didactic
sort of way. Yeah, that's a good question. What are the you're right, every kind of music or every artistic activity has its unique potential for failure. And then there's also a thing, this term I used, I came up with on my blog, and I was very pleased with it, and then I realized it's actually just a version, it's my Ponzi version of you can have too much of a good thing. But I call it the zone of fruitless intensification. Like there's almost an
Right.
axis. Any kind of music has an axis that works really well up to a certain point, but then you just try to go further on that axis, and it just becomes unenjoyable. So, like, say with IDM, say it gets really abstruse, and it because it sort of is not designed for the clubs. It has sort of beats, but they're kind of frustrating and kind of pull at your body, but you can't actually groove to it. It goes beyond groove. Post-punk went too dour and cerebral. That's the axis you go on. Gabba music got too fast. Jungle music, people got just so into the editing of the break beats, it got too kind of fussy. So I think with the future music, I don't know. I suppose a lot of experimental music is kind of unpleasant. It's just not enjoyable. Yeah. It's like a future you wouldn't want to inhabit. You're like, I'd actually rather listen to, a lovely folk song or the Smiths or something. If that's the future, I don't want to be there. The other thing I think actually with a lot of futures, it gets in this kind of kitsch kind of future imagery. It's sort of playing with received ideas of the future, robotics, and I don't know. An example actually of this thing happened to drum and bass, where I'd been a huge fan of jungle as it evolved to drum bass, like some of that, and then it got into this whole thing in the late 90s where every band had a name like Virus or Genetics or something like that, and it got into this whole kind of we are scientists of sound thing. And if you ever see the record artwork of these late 90s drum and bass artists, it's some of the worst kind of kitsch futurist imagery, and then the music is not very good either, but it's almost the trappings, calling yourself Genetics with spelling it with an X instead of
X, yeah,
or bands where it's got the word future in it, but they spell it with a PH, because that's sort of somehow more futuristic.
Numbers in band names, yeah.
So it gets into this sort of trying too hard. With this particular kind of drum and bass I'm talking about, I call it neurofunk, and this term bizarrely took off, and it has a visual iconography now, like a lot of the albums or stuff or flyers for neurofunk raves, they get like chemical protection masks, so it's sort of this whole idea of this Chernobyl like scenario, of people having to wear protective gear in the future, and I don't know.
I think that was a good answer to what is I think that every art form having a can fail in its own particular way, and maybe it is it's kitsch, it's kind of gone too far, it's too cold, too alien, too too much.
On the axis, there's this bit of the axis, this linear axis of like the zone of fruitful intensification, where you've discovered something and you just make it more intense. Like initially people were just looping simple break beats in jungle. Then they start chopping them up and making kind of almost new break beats out of fragments of break beats. And then they go too far into the zone of fruitless intensification, where it's just very, very fiddly, fussy music that you can tell someone has spent weeks and weeks moving beats around on their digital audio workstation and kind of splicing things together, like a neuroscientist or something.
I guess, and if you can hear that, then that's not. If you can kind of see that in your mind's eye when you're listening to it, not necessarily the best thing. Want to just move us on from failure to just two more kind of, I guess, points in the historical development, hopefully not to put it in a too grandiose way, of this kind of future tomorrow's music today. So one of them is Daft Punk. So this you have a chapter on this, and I actually found this to be quite kind of melancholic chapter.
Yeah.
So I think it's the one that deals most with the question of whether the kind of that, like, I don't know, the radical potential almost of that, the Donna Summer, the Kraftwerk, the kind of the early pioneers almost, whether that sort of future music is still possible today? Because you talk about Daft Punk's most recent album, Random Access Memories, and you say of your son that he doesn't really live with an idea of the future. And you say, by that I mean a cultural idea of the future. Obviously, time is unfolding in a linear direction. He looks forward to things. He has vague thoughts about college, what he'll do when he's a grown-up, but there is no special excitement about the future with a capital F, little sense that it'll be better or even dramatically different from the present. And then you conclude this chapter by saying the new as a category does seem to be uncoupled from any sense of progress in the cultural, artistic, political sense. And I guess my question here is whether this book in general, or this chapter maybe more narrowly, is almost like a requiem for this sort of future music, maybe if that's would be the right way of putting it, or maybe more like, do you feel a sort of a nostalgia almost for the kind of that stuff that when you would have heard it for the first time, you would have thought, wow, this could be the future. I can see the future because I can hear what it sounds like.
Yeah, well, that the Daft Punk record, which was absolutely fascinating, I thought, came out, I think, 2013. So it was a couple of years after Retromania. When it came out, I was like, damn, this would have been a perfect closing chapter. I could have done a whole chapter just on this one record, because it was very much like Daft Punk reaching this impasse. They could only go back. The only thing that was left for them to do was to do this record that was completely analog, using a real drummer and a real everything, working with their heroes. And then it also explores ideas to do with time and memory and nostalgia in some of the lyrics as well. They have a song about the space race, which would have been a motif in in Retromania. And it was like the perfect sort of culmination, and it was a record that on the surface was quite bright and cheerful. Get Lucky, was the big hit of it.
Very, very much so.
But underneath it's this deep melancholy, I think, of a group that don't know where to go forward, and they're sort of using this. They're still inspired by the things they were inspired by. Like they were very inspired by, I think, like Star Wars and early disco, early electro, and this sort of kind of naive ideas of a future. But at the exact point that they make this record, they don't know how to go any further with it. They do a record with Giorgio Moroder, where Giorgio Moroder is talking nostalgically about how he made I Feel Love and how it was a song from the future. But they don't collaborate with Moroder. Moroder's contribution is just his voice talking, and they do this sort of rather lame pastiche of the Moroder electronic disco sound, and it's like it's not even trying to do something new with it. It's just like a sort of faded echo of when music was futurism. So I think this would have been right at the point where everything was most gloomy, and also I think around that time, like it seemed like the space race had ended. I think they'd taken the space shuttle and they'd taken it on a farewell tour of the States, all from town to town, and then it ends up in the Smithsonian Museum. So it seemed like such a potent symbol of
the future being retired.
And even at the time, there was very little futuristic films being made. It was all like everything seemed to be sort of Game of Thronesy, sort of like set in some. It was all the Lord of the Rings films, and I don't know. Since the piece was done, or it was like a talk I gave, there's actually been a resurgence of films about space. There's been many countries have renewed space programs, including India, I think, and there's also been some music that I would say is genuinely futuristic, which is the trap music. The autotune trap and other extreme uses of autotune. So I'm a bit more optimistic than when I wrote that piece, but it captures a moment when I'm also looking at my son and seeing what he's interested in, and just generally thinking, I think it's true. I do think it's true. I think William Gibson said this actually, but he said like by this point in the 20th century, say the 1924, if you look at culture, there were hundreds, thousands of references to the 21st century. And like, if you look at now, like no one talks about the 22nd century, do they? We don't have these sort of years that we're like. I don't even really have a picture of what 2050 is going to be like, except it's probably going to be terrible, and the climate crisis will be catastrophic by that point. I feel like we don't. So I don't think my son's generation doesn't really, for understandable reasons, doesn't really have a sort of projective year that is not entirely negative.
No, I think that point, comparing kind of visions of the 20th century from 1924 to visions of the 22nd century from today, is absolutely, I think that's a great illustration. And there is a very pervasive cultural pessimism. But one reason you, I think, in the book give for, I'm trying to segue this, for some sort of cultural optimism potentially, and surprisingly, maybe for our listeners, is autotune. So this is a much maligned, I was going to say style of music, but it's almost like a defining instrument.
It's like a template. It's a transcultural field of action, isn't it? Or a template? Yeah, I guess. Yeah, transgeneric.
So you say that and I think this is probably the first, big hit that listeners will have heard of using autotune is "Believe" by Cher. This is the sound of leaving the 20th century. What I guess for listeners who might be skeptical, as I think I was starting to read the essay, what is it that you sort of see as the potential of autotune? And is it a more general point that it's the voice is the area of innovation in the 21st century, or is there more, is this a new technology just like the synthesizer before it that could usher in a kind of a period of pop music?
Well, with autotune, my initial reactions to it were much the same as anyone's. I quite taken with the Cher song, but very quickly it came to seem like a fad. And I think the first time I heard it, where I sort of reconsidered it, was the Kanye West album 808s and Heartbreak. I was like, oh, that is interesting the way he's using it. It's actually enabling him to sing, which is not something you've done before. But it still was pretty much like, oh, it's irritating. And then, funnily enough, around the time of Retromania, I didn't talk about autotune in the book, but I did a lot of talks and I did pieces around it. And I start to say this thing about, actually, if there is one thing that defines the 21st century and that we'll actually look back to with nostalgia, it's this autotune sound that's sort of everywhere. It's like, it's in rap music, but it's also in every kind of pop music. It's in dancehall. It's in, it just pops up all over the place. Afro beats. But then I suppose when I became obsessed with it was around 2016. It seemed to sort of transform the sound of rap music. So rappers were rapping while hearing their own voices on headphones through autotune. So they were sort of learning how to push the effect in real time. And it wasn't like there was an original performance that was untampered with. It wasn't like there's an original performance and then the producer puts an effect on it. They are in a symbiotic system with the technology, pushing it, and they're actually kind of moving to zone where it's between rapping and singing. They're doing strange kind of vocal ornaments and trills, and it's just the texture of it as well. So it's sort of an artistically enabling tune with people like Future, Young Thug, Migos, but it's also the texture of it is so ethereal and kind of androgynous in a weird way. And what I felt was really interesting with rap was that lyricism drops away as the point of the music. It's actually now just making weird sounds with your voice and this kind of, kind of very emotional, highly strung sound in a lot of cases. Like Young Thug is,
Can I ask something about this? Because I was very intrigued by that chapter as well, and found the way I would come to it is that I also kind of dislike auto-tune. Whenever I would hear it, I thought it sounds kind of silly, it's everywhere, etc. Which I think is kind of a lot of people's reaction, certainly if they're not like in their 20s now or something. But reading that chapter, the point that comes across is how much this is sort of cyborg music. As you've been saying, there's a kind of melding between the man and the machine at the level of voice. So it's not just your guitar being super putting it through loads of pedals and effects and all the rest of it. It's the human voice, which is kind of already altered somehow by machine as soon as it leaves the person's mouth, and the ability to kind of recreate the whole apparatus of someone's throat, or their singing, their human instrument was fascinating. I'm interested because the type of music that you highlight as the kind of apex of the use of autotune and related technologies is trap. And there you point out that the thematic content is like, I mean, it's not futuristic at all. It's kind of it's the
It's
usual,
progressive. Yeah.
huh?
It's the
Yeah.
same old shit. Yeah.
Well, it's the same old shit, and perhaps even more downbeat in a way than the usual bling and bitches kind of and guns themes of like gangster rap. It's kind of more I don't know, more sort of despondent, more turned on itself, more depressive in a way. I don't know, like the whole affect of being of kind of mumble rap and all that kind of thing as well, which I think is probably associated. So I mean, how do you what's your interpretation of cyborg music, which when the cyborg comes to speak and he's just talking about drinking lean?
Yeah, that is the thing where it's remarkable, mind-blowing sort of technology. A young writer I'm friendly with, Kit McIntosh, talks about vocal psychedelia in this book he did, Neon Screens, which is specifically about trap and dancehall and the use of it. But it's uncoupled from any sort of progressive politics, and it's even seems to be more linked to a kind of decadence. And you're right, the affect in a lot of this music made using it is kind of downbeat and numb and insulated. I think it relates a lot to drug use. There's a lot of references in these songs to Xanax and Percocet and these sort of actually legal but abusable drugs that are for killing anxiety or dealing with depression. And some people are kind of numbed out. There's you mentioned lean. That's another sort of dissociative drug, a sort of cough medicine concoction. But there's a whole pharmacopoeia. People are mixing as a polydrug kind of culture, and a culture of sort of numbing yourself out. And there's an amazing song by Future, I think, with Juice WRLD called Oxycontin, which is very, very vocally weird, but also the subjectivity it speaks to is kind of alarming. And I think a lot of it's futuristic, but it's uncoupled from sort of hope or sort of feelings of going anywhere as politically or culturally into a bright tomorrow.
No, yeah.
Which is it's depressing. It's depressing.
So I guess I wanted to just ask a question about kind of looking at this because we've talked a little bit about Donna Summer, about Kraftwerk, about this kind of space music, Vangelis and Jean-Michel Jarre. There's chapters in the book on dub reggae as well, UK synth pop. Just in case listeners had not had their favorite genre mentioned, or their favorite artists. I think we mentioned grime and dubstep earlier. So all of this kind of a lot of different styles of music, but all linked by this kind of future music concept. What, considering them as a whole, and I guess looking back, what comes out of this kind of development? Do you think that the music has gotten more introspective? Has it got more depressive? Have kind of new concepts come out? Has the kind of the idea of the post-human perhaps developed? You talk a bit about, and we'll link to the NTS playlist because I think there's some interesting tracks in there. It seems like, you know, the kind of the last stop on this journey, perhaps, or a very recent one, is in this track called "Forever" by Patton, which is very AI vocalified, and, you know, quite a you know, not an abrasive listen, but quite striking when you first put it on, particularly if you're playing it quite loud, as I I happen to be. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is, you know, what comes out of this kind of, you know, this period starting in the late 70s coming up to today. What do you think as you move through it? Can you notice any of these kind of increasing negativities and depressiveness and introversion?
I think there's always been, you know, there's been, like, rather like the genre of science fiction, there's always been more dystopian visions of the future than there have been of, you know, utopia achieved. You know, I mean, I think so. There's a sort of play between the two often. Like, I have an interview with a guy called Gerald in there, and he's talking of, you know, he's dealing with ideas of surveillance and, you know, use of technology by the powers that be, but also he's quite confident that it can be hacked, you know, and it can be, you can, the little guy can fight back, the street can fight back. He talks about ghetto technology, which is almost like an echo of William Gibson's famous saying, you know, the street finds its own use for things, you know, which you can hit, you know, I can't remember what that was in the context of, but in music technology, the street often finds uses in music technology that weren't intended by the manufacturers, and comes up with, you know, abuses technology and comes up with new sounds. But, you know, there's, you know, a lot of the history of this music has been sort of dark images of the future, apocalyptic images, but also sometimes images of, like, you know, a pleasure dome, of a sort of utopian pleasure factory, you know, those sort of Barbarella type ideas of bright, hedonistic sort of future.
Yeah.
I think they're both, you know, they're all going at the same time. There isn't really a trend as such. I mean, I find this music, you know, I think it's gone off the boil a bit, the autotune track, but I think at its peak towards the end of 2010s, I just found it ecstatic music. It gave me these sort of feelings that I would have got off some of the IDM you mentioned, like the Aphex Twin stuff, but all, and groups like Seafield, but also like Shoegaze and the Cocteau Twins, this sort of blurry sounds, and the rappers, even though they're rapping about Patek watches and their cars with suicide doors and all this stuff, or girls, they sound kind of like little angel beings, like ethereal, androgynous angel creatures, because of the effect of autotune. So I found it like bliss-inducing music, even though some of the actual lyrical content is depressing and sort of enthralled to capitalist commodity fetishism and the rest.
So,
you know.
I mean, in terms of like looking for something new, it, you know, you can scan kind of different kind of areas of the globe or across different cities, and obviously the perhaps a certain loss of local scenes has impacted the kind of generative effect of music. I don't know, but one thing that struck me reading one of the early essays on Kraftwerk, and it's an idea where I was familiar with. I mean, it's the idea of Kraftwerk and other quote unquote krautrock bands, for how silly that term actually is. A lot of those bands sounded very European. They were kind of, to a certain extent, birthed outside of the heritage of blues and then rock and roll. And their, as you know, their whole aesthetic and everything, it just seems so, which they lean into, right, of being very German and orderly and whatever. And the whole thing is very European, very distinct from everything that's been happening in the United States, and United States influenced European music. And I wonder whether you see something like that happening today elsewhere, whether you think that's indeed possible. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, you know, homogenization and globalization, etc., which is by now a hackneyed theme. That's been something that's been debated a lot for the past 30 years or so. But, you know, whether you could imagine something coming out of a region of the world which is like kind of standing apart from what has become global American culture?
I don't know if I see that. I mean, I think, one of the things that's interesting, yeah, you're quite right. There's this Europeanism thing that not only is in craft work, but it's actually one of the reasons that sound is so attractive to the people in Detroit. Were very attracted to sort of ideas of Italy and German music, and somehow Italian fashion and Italian disco music, electronic disco music, was sort of all jumbled up in their imagination and alluring because it was so different from the surroundings of Detroit. Same with house music. I think was initially very attracted to these European sounds. But now I think, like you get a lot of sounds out of Africa that are very technological and digitally slick, like Afro beats from Nigeria, from West Africa is very, they use autotune to a great extent. It's very sort of super produced, glistening kind of music. Different kind of sound from South Africa. Amapiano is again, it's sort of like a mutant form of house music. It has none of the sort of, I guess, traditional Western associations of what African music is like are in it. It's like a totally modern urban sound coming out of Africa. It is participating in the American-dominated global pop sound in the same way that Korean, South Korean pop, K-pop, is like a sort of version of American mainstream pop music. But there's enough of a difference with these African dance sounds, I think, that it feels fresh, and it has no track with these sort of European imagery of modernity. It's like an African modernity that it speaks to.
Right.
So before, I actually wanted to ask you a question right on this kind of modernism point, but maybe just before that, and we can have that as the kind of the last question, because I think it is the, in some ways the, what are the stakes of this sort of music historically. But I had a question which is from a friend and some ex-guest on the podcast, which I guess is about music criticism, or you say maybe have a habit you identify as a rock critic. But do you think that this is like still possible today, being like a music critic or a music journalist? I guess the negative, just to kind of build on what Alex was saying, some of the negativity is that there's the necessity to sell the latest innovation means that many music journalists have essentially become kind of writing puff pieces which are very close to marketing, and that's not just in music. You could arguably say it's even more accelerated in cinema, and it's very difficult now, perhaps as a 16-year-old to book a room and get you and your 3 friends bands or whatever on to kind of have some kind of local gig. I mean, do you feel optimistic about? I mean, are there things that I just totally haven't mentioned, which give you some kind of hope for reading good music criticism, or is it like has kind of music journalism kind of been collapsed into marketing?
I think
what do you think?
There's still a lot of good work being done. Earlier this year, there was a bunch of things collapsed or went through potentially devastating changes, and I made a list of all the publications that had gone out of business in my sort of working lifetime, including ones I'd written for, and there were an awful lot of them. But then I made a list of the ones that were still there, and there was still quite a lot of places that will pay people to write for them and some of them do interesting work. And then there's a lot of people who are doing stuff, young bloggers who do blogs like Nobels and Tone Glow and these sort of, I think it's largely done for love. I mean, there might be some money involved, but it's generally just done out of passion as far as I can see. And they're very excited about new music, and they're writing about it intelligently and doing genre pieces and trying to sort of say more than just this is a new buzzword thing. There's an awful lot of froth and tattle, and a lot of, as you say, this sort of puff piece writing and what in a weird way, although the monoculture has kind of shriveled to just a handful of artists, they seem in some ways more dominant in terms of the attention economy than ever. Like, the fact that Taylor Swift has a there's someone whose job at the New York Times, I think, is to just only write about Taylor Swift. That's very oligopolistic, isn't it, in terms of the attention economy? But there's so many little undergrounds and people making weird music and people who seem to want to write about it. So, I guess I feel like there's less people want to read it, but in a strange way, there's more people who want to do it and can do it on some level. Whether they can make a living from it, I don't know. I think a lot of people do it, but they have some other primary source of. Well, I was lucky enough to grow up at a time when I could. I mean, I've basically my life only written about music or in more recent years talked about it, like either in a teaching context or doing events or whatever. And that's basically all I've done, except for 1 year when I was an editor. But that was possible then because there were places that had, because of advertising, there were places like Melody Maker, there was so much advertising from record companies and tour promoters. They could sustain a lot of pages in a weekly music paper. And even though the pay per word was terrible, you could write so many words, you could actually make a living.
Yeah,
just to fill the pages,
I guess that maybe that option doesn't exist for our younger listeners in quite the same way. But I mean,
I think it has become a part-time thing, for a lot of people.
Perhaps, but
I can keep it pure in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you also mentioned some writers and some books which listeners should check out because there is good stuff out there, definitely. But I guess just so in the afterword you talk about our friend Fred Jameson, and particularly his idea that this the modernist artwork is defined by its relationship to time. It enacts a break with past forms of art within itself, and that's quite an exciting way of thinking about any art form. But I guess my sort of take on Futuromania was that it's almost this kind of review of the achievements of a kind of modernist strain of pop music from the late 70s onwards. And I think in the book it does come through this kind of embattled humanist idea that there is something to be said for this kind of modernism in pop music. Would you say that this is an accurate? I mean, maybe two parts to this question. Is this the right sort of way to understand this in the kind of the biggest historical context? And what are you listening to at the moment to try and find this? You mentioned trap music, and that comes, and it wasn't a genre I was particularly familiar with, but did go and listen to quite a bit. And we'll link, and just to say again, to this NTS playlist. So this is you introduce a number of tracks for this Hackney based kind of online radio platform. So there's some stuff in there. But I guess just to again a bit of a rambling question, but two parts. One, is this a kind of a document of pop modernism? And two, where do you find that kind of pop artwork, if you do indeed find it anywhere in stuff that you're listening to at the moment?
I mean, it's sort of I wouldn't say it's like a requiem for this mode, but it's like it's a historical survey of moments where music seemed to sort of herald either the future of pop music generally, but also a future in the larger sense. And sort of science fictional strain of music. It's not one tradition, one clear homogeneous continuum of this. It's like outcrops of it, occurrences of it, pops up all over the place. Dub reggae is sort of coming up with something that it doesn't really involve synths, but it is like a sound you never heard before, and it combines both ideas of going back through time and ancestral, antiquity, the Bible, and all that, with these sort of sometimes imagery that is futuristic. And I think Lee Perry once called himself a space computer or something like that, and his relationship with the mixing desk was kind of like cyborgian merger of man and machine, and he was neurologically engineering strange states of mind through all the we do smoking. So yeah, so they're sort of discontinuous eruptions of this sort of modernist futurist spirit. And what does it mean? I think one of the things I explore is there isn't necessarily in this afterword to this book, there isn't necessarily a connection between using the latest technology and having any kind of futuristic or politically progressive use. And in fact, a lot of the latest technology is being used to create deep fakes and propaganda, or just very mainstream, almost subliminally fascist kind of entertainments. Some of the sort of the most amazing editing and sound effects and grading is being done in sort of really politically reactionary kind of films, mainstream films. Where do I find it now? I hear things. I'm waiting to see what's going to happen with AI. I don't really discuss it that much in the book, but I thought that pattern record was really interesting. A record from a little earlier that I only just heard by Debit called The Long Count is using AI, but in a very eerie way, much more almost like a hauntological way, like a kind of the sounds produced seem to not so much reverberate into betoken future music, but sort of access I don't know, something not exactly primordial, but something ancestral and eerie. I think it's an attempt to use AI to recreate these instruments from the past. I'm not exactly sure. I didn't read up on it, but it's very spooky sounding. A lot of AI is being used in this purely regurgitative way. It's like sort of creating forgeries of existing things. So that's innately not that futuristic.
No, I'll check that out. I think anything which is unlike something you haven't something you've ever heard before is always something to check out. But that thanks so much, Simon. Covered obviously massive amount of stuff, different sorts of music and historical period and ideas as well. So thanks so much for joining us.
But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I do listen to a lot of like what you would call past futurisms. I listen to a lot of old music concrete and stuff, but I don't really. I don't have many examples of things from now that I would describe that would fit in a volume like Futuromania. I think AI is the thing that's like, are people going to do interesting things with it? What will it be?
What will it sound? Yeah, I mean, what will it sound like? Because I guess the premise is almost like AI can only reproduce what's already there. How do you get something new from what already exists? But that's what all newness, I guess, ultimately has to come from. You've got to start
I think
somewhere.
I'm a bit more. I'm a bit more okay. Ironically, having just published this book, I'm a bit more okay with the idea of music that is sort of reworking or remodeling older stuff. So I mean, a lot of music I've enjoyed recently has actually been kind of this new shoegaze music, because it sort of does remind me of the stuff I liked in the 90s, but it's sufficiently different to sort of feel like it's not just a retread.
I did not see that coming back, but
my students love it. I mean, they're obsessed with shoegaze, and many of the papers they gave me were on the original people like Slow Dive and Cocteau Twins and that sort of stuff.
Wow.
It seems. I think there's something about the sound. It's very cushiony and dreamy, and you kind of.
It's similar a little bit to like the trap stuff. I mean, sonorically different, but the affect again is like kind of a bit psychedelic, a bit kind of. Well, you're staring at your shoes, or getting a bit lost in things somehow.
It's kind of like you're swaddling yourself in sound. I think it is sort of, in a weird way, sanctuary or solace music, in some way, which I think again speaks to the times we live in.
Yeah, you can think like My Bloody Valentine is quite leany music in a way.
Well, it's the sound of nausea, I think. So like that. So maybe that's, I don't know. Does lean make you nauseous? It sounds nauseating to drink. I wouldn't want to drink cough syrup.
I remember once taking Robitussin or something like that when I had a flu and having an incredible hallucinatory, unpleasant experience. in the 90s, but I wasn't doing it on purpose. um, so what have you heard that you think is innovative or new then? Anything?
No, I think I've well, there's a band called Horse Lords which I'm listening
All right.
to quite a bit, and it's kind of, I don't know, post math rock. It's multi hyphenate stuff, but it's actually like, you know, it makes you move, and it's, I don't know, it's
Mm,
something where I was just like, I haven't heard anything like this for a little while. It made me think of Battles, which do
mm,
but a bit rockier. So that's the sort of stuff that. But yeah, I've been algorithmified where I just get, you know, suggested to me,
mm.
because I don't read any music publications. Don't read Melody Maker anymore. Used to,
It doesn't exist.
a little while
It's
ago. Yeah,
long out of business,
um,
but you don't read any. Oh, that's discouraging.
I would like to read a
A lot of
paper
my
one.
students don't read music papers either, or music
Yeah,
criticism. It's very. But I was hoping you did.
yeah. No, I guess
What
it's
about you?
like.
Do you read it?
Uh,
Read anything?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't. I don't either. I've often asked. I've even asked George, who has shown himself obviously not to have any recommendations either. But like, what should I read of music journalists? Because every once in a while, I want to get back into it. You know, get back into reading about music, which has been, you know, years and years and years since I have. And I spend a lot of time just reading about politics. So it's like, well, it'd be nice to be able to do that, but I don't even know where to go.
Yeah,
Which, yeah.
there's
do you
so
have any
much to read.
recommendations of publications actually that we should
Um,
check out?
well, I mean, I think this place Nobels is good. My son actually writes to them every so often. But it's very much like these sort of online micro genres, sort of hyper pop and things related to that. Like some of it is like the rap that I like, but it's like taking it too far. Like it's so insanely auto tuned and processed. It's actually unpleasant to my ears. But you know, to hit my son's generation, um, the more fucked up it sounds, the better. And he actually goes to like clubs and little tiny mini raves in Brooklyn where people DJ, and so it does have a social element. It's not just entirely online. But Nobel's is good. I think. I don't know. I'm blanking. A lot of the things that I really liked of music writing have been in book form, actually. And they haven't necessarily been about the latest music. I mentioned this guy who did the book Neon Screens, which I think is really amazing.
I,
Yeah.
I guess I generally tend to listen to NTS now. That's why I mentioned it, because it's like, here's something which I'm going to hear,
right?
something that I might not like, and that is almost the condition of I want to listen to things that I might not like, because everything else is so like, it's very, very safe, and you don't take that risk of buying that CD and thinking, well, I better listen to this because I'm not going to have another one for a little while, and just, you know, have to get into it, even if you think on first listen this is.
I find there's a lot of things I listen to once, you know, and that's the problem with using streamers is it's you sort of have to make an effort to return to something that you've found intriguing or whatever.
Yeah.
Unless it sort of conquers you instantly, you might not go back to it. Yes, I mean, I think that's not having a CD you bought lying around the house. It's sort of, you forget about things. I find.
Yeah. No, I mean, it stares at you if you don't listen to it enough, and you know, that's how you get into new things, because you've taken the plunge on this thing that was recommended to you, and yeah.